The document arrived without a cover sheet. That was the first thing Sera noticed. Not the weight of the sealed folder, not the escort of 2 counterintelligence officers who had never once met her eyes during the 40-minute transit from the relay station. Not even the fact that Director Halloran had cleared his office of every aide and analyst before handing it to her personally. The first thing she noticed was the absence of a cover sheet. Every classified document she had handled in 19 years of service had a cover sheet. Classification level, originating office, handling instructions, data creation, the administrative scaffold that told you, before you open anything, what kind of thing you were about to read. This had none of that. It was just pages. Halloran said, "Take your time," and stood at the window with his back to her, which she understood was a courtesy. She opened the folder. 47 names. Human names. All of them. She checked twice, because the thought that any of them might be hybrid analysts like Cale had occurred to her, and she wanted to be certain. They were not. 47 full humans. 17 active military officers ranging from lieutenant to vice admiral. 11 scientists attached to various xenobiology and weapons research divisions. 9 intelligence analysts. 6 government administrators with security clearances at the highest levels. And 4 individuals whose current status was listed as deceased. Next to each name, rank, division, the estimated period of their contact with the Veth Collective, and a single word in a column that had no header. Sera read the first entry. The word was conviction. She read the next. Conviction. She went through all 47. The word never changed. 20 years, she said. The earliest confirmed contact is from 23 years ago. Actually, we've given the column some latitude. Halloran still hadn't turned around. The 4 who are deceased, 2 died in unrelated circumstances. 1 was killed in action at the Karev engagement. 1 took her own life 8 years ago. We don't know if that last one is related. You want them arrested? No. Sera looked up from the folder. Halloran had turned now, and he looked, she thought, like a man who had not slept properly in several months. She had known him for 11 years. He had always been a man who slept well. Then what? I want to know if they were right. She was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the station's inner ring was cycling through its rotation, and the light shifted slowly from the gray of filtered starlight to something warmer. You're asking me to validate 47 acts of treason. I'm asking you to determine whether 47 separate people, none of whom knew about each other, independently reached the same conclusion about the Veth Collective, and whether that conclusion has merit. The treason is already committed. The question is whether the intelligence has value. He paused. That is a different question. It requires a different kind of investigation. You're attaching Cale to this. It wasn't a question. Cale was the obvious choice. The only hybrid analyst with sufficient clearance, with the right combination of human intelligence training, and whatever was a Veth side of his genetics gave him that no one in the division had ever quite been willing to name directly. Sera had worked with Cale on 3 previous investigations. She liked him. She trusted him, which was a different thing. Cale has been briefed, Halloran said. He's waiting outside. Sera closed the folder. She thought about cover sheets, about the administrative logic of them, the way they created a layer of preparation between a person and a difficult thing. She thought about what it meant that this one had none. Then she picked up the folder and stood. How long do I have? Until it matters, Halloran said, which was not an answer. She recognized it as the only honest answer he had. Cale was in the corridor. He was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, and his eyes directed at a point on the floor approximately 2 meters ahead of him, which was his posture for waiting. He was a tall man, angular in a way that was partly the Veth genetics and partly just him. The bone structure slightly wrong by human standards, the eyes a pale gray that shifted towards silver in certain lights. People who did not know him found the eyes unsettling. Sera had stopped noticing them years ago. You've seen the list, she said. I have. Thoughts? He looked up. The silver-gray eyes held something she couldn't name, but that was not unusual. There were registers of expression in Cale's face that she had never fully learned to read. I think, he said, that whoever assembled this list spent a very long time being careful about that word. Conviction. I think they chose it deliberately. As opposed to what? Coercion. Compromise. Calculation. He uncrossed his arms. All the other words we use for why people do things we don't expect them to do. They ruled all those out. For 47 people. 20 years. He paused. That's either the most thorough piece of counterintelligence work I've ever seen, or it's the most important thing anyone has handed us in the history of this war. Possibly both, Sera said. Possibly both, he agreed, and they went to work. She started with the dead because the dead were simpler. Not simple in the sense of easier. The records of the deceased were often the most fragmented, the most reliant on second-hand accounts and reconstructed timelines, but simpler in that the dead could not be further damaged by what she found. There was a kind of ethical clarity to it. Whatever she uncovered about Lieutenant Commander Ashapran, who had died at Korea with 3 commendations and a classified contact log that stretched back 14 years, would not result in Pren's arrest or her family's public devastation. It would result only in understanding. Sera found she could approach the dead with directness she couldn't yet afford with the living. Pren had been a tactical analyst attached to the Outer Reach Defense Coordination. Her contact with the Veth had not been through any formal channel. There were no formal channels between humanity and the Veth, had never been, which was itself a fact worth sitting with, but through a series of encounters during the contested space patrols that were officially skirmishes. Reading the reconstructed record, Sera began to understand that Pren had not experienced them as skirmishes. She had experienced them as something closer to conversations conducted in a language neither side had agreed to speak, where the grammar was maneuver and the vocabulary was restraint. Veth ships that could have destroyed Pren's patrol vessel and had not. Formations that opened corridors rather than closed them. Pren had noted all of this in reports that her superiors had classified as tactical observations and filed accordingly. What her superiors had not seen, what Sera now saw, reading them in sequence for the first time, was that Pren had been writing the same sentence over and over for 14 years in slightly different words. They are not trying to kill us. They are trying to tell us something. 14 years. And then Karev, where the engagement had gone wrong in ways that the official account described as Veth aggression, and that Pren, in her final communication, had described as... Sera read the fragment 3 times, a misunderstanding so fundamental it may not be recoverable. She set Pren's file aside and opened the next. Dr. Merrick Osei had been a xenobiologist, lead researcher on the Veth biology program at Station Caro. He had died of cardiac failure 6 years ago, age 61, survived by 2 adult children and a professional legacy that included 40 papers on Veth's cellular structure, 2 of which had been foundational to the design of humanity's most effective weapon systems. He had also, according to the list, passed approximately 400 documents to the Veth over 11 years. Not weapon specifications. This was the detail that stopped Sera. Not tactical information. Not strategic assessments. What Osei had passed to the Veth were biological studies, human biology, primate biology, evolutionary records, genetic histories. The complete published archive of humanity's understanding of itself as a species. She spent a full day with Osei's personal records before she found a journal entry that made sense of it. It was not classified. It was in a document archive his daughter had donated to a university library, buried in a collection of professional correspondence, the kind of thing that no one would ever read without specific reason to look, dated 9 years before his death. The working hypothesis in my field is that the Veth attack human settlements because they perceive humans as a threat to their reproductive cycles. I have spent 3 years trying to verify this, and I cannot. What I can verify is that the Veth consistently target specific categories of insulation rather than others, and that the pattern maps almost exactly onto sites where we have conducted research that, if the Veth were reading the way I am beginning to suspect they read it, would suggest to them that we are planning a biological intervention against their species. We are not planning this. We do not have the capacity to plan this. But I do not know how to tell them that except to show them what we actually are. Sera sat with this for a long time. Then she opened the 3rd file. By the 6th name, she had stopped being surprised by any individual case and had begun to see the shape. It was not a conspiracy. She had been given a list of 47 names and told to find out if they were accurate and what she had been half expecting. What the word list implied, with a suggestion of coordination, of network, of shared purpose, was not what she was finding. What she was finding was something more disquieting than conspiracy. Conspiracy required communication. Conspiracy required people knowing about each other, sharing intelligence, reinforcing each other's conclusions. What she was finding in the first names was isolation. Each person had arrived at their position alone, in the dark, carrying it alone. Lieutenant Commander Pran had not known about Dr. Osei. Dr. Osei had not known about analyst Renata Chu, whose case Sera opened on day 4, and who had served in strategic communications for 8 years, parsing Veth transmission patterns, and who had, alone without resources, working evenings in a cramped office, she shared with 2 colleagues who thought she was running statistical models, produced a partial translation framework for Veth signal architecture that no official program had come close to replicating. Chu was alive. She was currently senior analyst at the Meridian Intelligence Hub, with a clearance level that gave her access to roughly 60% of humanity's strategic intelligence picture. She had no idea she was on the list. Sera read her file and thought about the translation framework, which Chu had never submitted through official channels, which he had, according to the reconstructed record, used only to send a single transmission to a Veth vessel during a border patrol encounter 7 years ago. A transmission that the vessel had, apparently, acknowledged. Sera called Cale into her office that evening. He reviewed the 6 files in the order she had read them. She watched him read, which was something she had done before on other investigations, and which was always informative. Cale read quickly, with total stillness, and he had a habit when he encountered something significant of going even more still, a kind of intensification of his baseline quiet that she had learned to recognize as the equivalent of another person leaning forward. She saw it happen twice with Pren's file, for time with Osei's, and continuously throughout Chu's. When he finished, he closed the last file and set it on the desk with a care that was slightly different from how he'd set down the others. The word they chose, he said, conviction. You keep coming back to that. Because the alternative framings are all wrong. Pren wasn't manipulated. Osei wasn't operating on bad intelligence. His intelligence was better than anyone in his division, including his superiors. Chu, he stopped. Chu, Sera agreed. Chu produced a functional translation framework, working alone in her spare time. His voice was very level. The official Xenolinguistics program has been running for 15 years with a staff of 40, and they have not produced anything comparable. He paused. I'd like to look at what she sent them. The single transmission. I know, Sera said. I've already requested the intercept record. Cale nodded. He picked up Pren's file again, opened it to the final communication, and read the fragment once more. Sera didn't need to read it again. She had it memorized by now. A misunderstanding so fundamental it may not be recoverable. She watched Cale's face, the slight intensification of his stillness as he read it, and she noted it, and she filed it, and she went to make coffee and try to think about something else. She found she couldn't. The investigation expanded. She had budgeted 2 weeks for the initial survey. It took 6. The living subjects required operational care. She could not simply request their files through standard channels without flagging the inquiry, and Halloran had been explicit that the investigation must not alert the 47 to their inclusion. So she worked through proxies, through archive records, through the kind of lateral access that counterintelligence officers develop over years of practice. The ability to reconstruct a person's professional and intellectual history from the traces they leave in other people's records. A mention in a colleague's after-action report. A citation in a research paper, a request log in an archive system that told you what documents a person had pulled in what sequence, and from which sequence you could infer what question they had been trying to answer. The question, she found, was always the same. 47 people had spent years, in some cases careers, try to answer the same question, each one believing themselves alone in asking it. The question was not what do the Veth want? The question was more precise than that. The question was, what do the Veth believe about us that is wrong? Vice Admiral Tennekin had commanded 3 major engagements, 2 of them by tactical measures that were still studied at the war colleges. He had also, over 9 years, passed a series of strategic planning documents to Veth intelligence. Not the plans themselves, but the reasoning architecture behind them, the documented decision-making process by which human military command weighed civilian lives, long-term settlement viability, and resource sustainability in its strategic calculations. Sera spent 3 days with Tennekin's case before she understood why. The Veth, as best humanities analysts had ever been able to determine, operated on a strategic logic that accounted for none of these variables. Their attack pattern suggested a calculus in which civilian populations were indistinguishable from military infrastructure, in which the long-term habitability of a settlement was irrelevant to its tactical value. Tennekin had been trying, Sera concluded, to demonstrate that this calculus was wrong, that humans did not operate this way, that the apparent human disregard for Veth territory that the Veth seemed to interpret as aggression was in fact something else, a species-level orientation toward expansion that was ecological rather than predatory, that was not, despite its effects, an expression of the intention to destroy. He had believed that if the Veth could see how humans actually made decisions, the weighing, the hesitation, the enormous institutional weight given to minimizing harm, they would understand that the war was based on a misreading. Sera sat with this for a long time and then wrote in her notes. Tennekin believed the Veth were rational. He believed they were wrong, but he believed they were wrong the way an intelligent entity is wrong when it has insufficient information. She wrote beneath that. He may have been correct. Then she closed the document and did not reopen it for 2 days. Dr. L. Schreiber had been a physicist, dead 4 years, who had passed materials related to human energy consumption patterns. This had seemed on the surface the most inexplicable of the cases. What possible intelligence value could Veth operatives extract from a record of how much power humanity used, and where, and for what? Sera spent a week with Schreiber's personal archive before she found the answer, and when she found it, she sat very still at her desk for a long time with the lights in her office, doing their slow, dimming cycle around her. Schreiber had developed a hypothesis, supported by modeling work she had never submitted for peer review because she had understood, she wrote, that it would be dismissed, and that the dismissal would be used to argue that the question itself was settled when it was not. Her hypothesis was this: the Veth attack human energy infrastructure, always, in every engagement without exception, not because they were trying to cripple human civilization, but because they were trying to prevent a specific kind of expansion. Schreiber had mapped human energy consumption growth against Veth territorial behavior and had found a correlation she described in her private notes as too precise to be coincidental and too uncomfortable to publish. The Veth were not at war with humanity. The Veth were at war with a future version of humanity, a version that, if Schreiber's models were correct, would within approximately a century be consuming energy at rates that would directly interfere with Veth reproductive infrastructure located, unbeknownst to human strategists, in a band of space that humanity was expanding toward along its most direct economic trajectory. The Veth were not fighting the war that was happening. They were fighting the war they believed was inevitable. Schreiber had understood this and had passed her models to the Veth not as an act of surrender, but as an act of proof. Here is what we are. Here is what we consume. Here is what we need. Compare this to what you believe about us and see the difference. She had believed, apparently, that if the Veth could see the actual trajectory rather than the projected one, they would understand that humanity was not on a course toward their reproductive space, that the expansion was directional rather than total, that it could be redirected. Sera drafted a note to herself. Schreiber's models require independent verification. She paused over the sentence for a long time, then added, independent verification will require Veth cooperation. She paused again. Then she deleted the note entirely. The picture was building. She began to notice the texture of it, not just a conclusion that each person had reached, but the quality of the conviction, the particular weight of what it cost each of them to carry it alone. Analyst Dominguez, who had served in forward intelligence for 12 years, had developed anxiety disorder during the period of his contact with the Veth, attended mandatory counseling, and reported in session notes that Sera was not supposed to be able to access, but did, a recurring experience of feeling responsible for something enormous that he could not name. Commander Phelan Nakashima had requested transfer out of tactical command twice during her period of contact, citing operational fatigue, and had both times been denied, and had both times returned to her post and continued what she was doing. Scientist Theo Marchetti had published prolifically during the years he was passing information, had won 2 divisional commendations, and had left behind, in a personal file, discovered only after his death, a letter to his daughter that he had never sent, explaining what he had done and why, in language so careful and so loving that Sera, reading it, found herself needing to set the document down and look at the middle distance for several minutes before she could continue. I did not do it because I stopped loving the people I served. Marchetti had written, I did it because I could not stop loving them enough to let the war continue on false premises. False premises. She had now encountered this phrase, or close variants of it, in 11 of the 47 cases. Not as a rationalization, not as a rhetoric of defection. She had read enough defection cases in her career to recognize the texture of self-serving narrative, but as a specific, technical, precise conclusion of people who had spent years examining the evidence and arrived, alone, at the same place. The war had begun on false premises. The Veth had formed a belief about humanity that was incorrect. Humanity, receiving Veth aggression as unprovoked attack, had formed a belief about the Veth that was equally incorrect, and the war, once begun, had generated its own evidence, its casualties, its devastation, its accumulated grief that made the original false premises progressively harder to see. By the time Sera reached the 31st name, she had stopped thinking of the investigation as an investigation into treason and had started thinking of it as something else. She did not yet have a name for what it was. She wrote in her private notes, in the small hours of a Tuesday morning when Cale had gone to his quarters and she was alone with the files. 47 people, none of whom knew the others existed, over 20 years, working in isolation, looking at the same evidence, reaching the same conclusion. In scientific terms, this is called independent replication. In intelligence terms, we do not have a word for it, because we have never needed one. She paused. She wrote, We have needed one. She went back to the files. The pattern continued to assemble itself. The scientists almost universally had passed biological or physical data, information about what humanity was as a species, its fundamental parameters. The military officers had almost universally passed strategic reasoning, information about how humanity made decisions. The intelligence analysts had passed translation work, signal analysis, pattern recognition, information about how humanity tried to understand. And the administrators had passed something more diffuse and more strange. They had passed records of disagreement, formal dissent logs, committee disputes, policy debates, the institutional record of humanity arguing with itself. Sera spent 2 full days trying to understand why before she arrived at the answer, and when she arrived at it, she sat with it for an entire night. The Veth, if the fragmentary intelligence picture held, appeared to perceive human civilization as a singular intentional entity, a mind, roughly, a collective will. The administrators have been trying, each alone, to demonstrate that this was wrong, that humanity was not a will but a process, not an intention but a negotiation, not a predator but an ecology of competing interests in which no single purpose could survive without constant revision. They had been passing the Veth humanity's arguments with itself because they believed that if the Veth could see the arguments, they would understand that there was no unified human intention to destroy them, because there was, in fact, no unified human intention to do anything. Sera looked at the picture she had assembled. 47 people, 20 years. Biologists saying, here is what we are. Officers saying, here is how we decide. Analysts saying, here is how we reach across the distance. Administrators saying, here is how we fail to agree. Together the 47 constituted, she realized, a complete portrait, a full account of humanity, its biology, its strategy, its language, its internal contradiction, assembled in pieces by people who had no idea they were contributing to a whole. She wrote in her notes, they were not a conspiracy. They were a choir, each one singing alone, in a different room, in the dark, never hearing the others. And the song they were all singing was the same song. Then she closed her notebook and did not write in it again for 4 days. She noticed it first on a Wednesday, 6 weeks into the investigation, during a review session in which they were working to the cases of 3 analysts whose contact with the Veth had overlapped with major engagement periods, the kind of coincidence that required careful examination to determine whether the contact had contributed to human casualties. It had not, in any of the 3 cases. The information pass had been, in all 3 instances, of the same character as the broader pattern, self-portrait rather than intelligence in any weaponizable sense. Sera walked through the analysis. Cale confirmed each step, and then she moved to the 4th case in session, and Cale said, yes, When she asked if he was following, and she continued, and everything proceeded normally. But something had shifted. She didn't identify it until 2 hours later, after he had left, when she was reviewing her notes from the session, and found that she had written, next to his name, a small notation she didn't remember making, Q. She looked at it for a moment. Then she continued with the notes. The following week was the week of the military officers, the heaviest concentration on the list, the cases requiring the most operational care. She and Cale spent long hours in the secure room, working through case files that were themselves classified at levels that required physical paper rather than digital records, and it was in this week that the quality of the silences changed in a way she began to be unable to ignore. He was not less engaged. He was not slower or less thorough. His analysis remained precise, his observations acute, but between observations, in the spaces that had previously been occupied by the kind of ambient professional exchange that marks a functional working relationship, the passing comment, the raised eyebrow, the brief moment of shared response to something unexpected in the record, the spaces were empty in a way they had not been before. She did not ask him about it. She noted it, in the precise internal register she had developed for noting things that required later examination, and she continued working. The case of analyst Renata Chu required a meeting, in person, in a cover context, because Chu was active and senior and could not be approached directly. Sera had constructed a pretext, a routine review of communications protocols at the Meridian Hub, the kind of inspection that happened periodically and that no analyst of Chu's seniority would find remarkable. She went alone. Cale remained at their working office, which was not the standard protocol for the investigation, but which she had decided, in the days preceding the meeting, was the right call. She had told him it was a logistical matter, a question of cover integrity, and he had accepted this without comment. The absence of comment where comment had previously been natural was itself a data point. Chu was a small, precise woman in her mid-40s who conducted herself with the particular economy of movement characteristic of people who had spent careers in dense offices processing large volumes of information. She was courteous during the protocol review, attentive, professional. Sera watched her throughout and looked for the things she was looking for, the weight, the specific quality of carrying something alone, and found it immediately in the slight careful completeness of her answers, the way she said everything she needed to say and nothing she did not deception, not concealment, something more like the practiced equilibrium of a person who has long since made peace with a private burden and learned to carry it without outward evidence. At the end of the meeting, as Sera was preparing to leave, Chu said, "Can I ask you something?" Sera said yes. The translation work. Chu said, "The kind that gets filed and doesn't go anywhere, the official program." She paused. "Is anyone looking at why it doesn't work?" Sera kept her face neutral. "Can you say more about that?" "The approach, the fundamental approach. The official program is trying to decode Veth communication, as if it's an encoding problem, as if there's a cipher and we need the key." Chu's voice was entirely professional, which was itself notable. But Veth communication isn't encoded. It's contextual. The meaning isn't in the signal. It's in the pattern of signals over time and in the relationship between the signal and the behavior that accompanies it. She stopped. "I've written this up 3 times. It keeps coming back as outside my division scope." A pause. "I just wondered if anyone was looking at it from outside." "I'll look into it," Sera said, which was not untrue. She returned to the working office. Cale was at his desk, reviewing case files, and he looked up when she entered and she saw, for a moment, that she was careful not to extend what was in his face. Not a performed expression, not a constructed one, something that had been there. She now understood, for several weeks, becoming incrementally less contained. She crossed the room, sat down, and began writing up the meeting notes, and from her peripheral vision she watched him watch her, and then he went back to files. She began to count the silences. This was a practice she had used once before, on an investigation that had involved a subject who was concealing not information but understanding, who knew something that had become so heavy that the knowing had changed his relationship to language, to ordinary exchange, to the space between words. The counting was not precisely counting. It was more a calibration, an effort to map the texture of someone's silence against the content of what surrounded it and determine what the silence was about. It was the kind of work that required patience and proximity and the willingness to hold conclusions lightly for long periods, which were skills Sera had developed over 19 years, and which she sometimes thought were the only skills she genuinely possessed. The silences she found came most consistently at two kinds of moments. The first was during analysis of cases where the subject had passed biological or physiological data to the Veth, Dr. Osei's case, Schreiber's case, and a third case involving a geneticist named Andrus, whose materials were the most technically complex on the list. Kale's silences at these moments were not long. They were dense, a quality of compression in the stillness that she had learned to associate in her reading of him with the processing of something that required more space than was immediately available. The second kind of moment was subtler. It came during discussion of what the 47 had believed about what the Veth wanted. The underlying question, the why of the entire investigation. And here the silences were different. They were not compressed. They were open in a way that she found increasingly difficult to characterize, except that they reminded her, in some register she could not precisely name, of the expression on a person's face when they're listening to music they know very well, and that means something specific to them that they have not told you. She did not believe he was concealing information from her. She believed, and the precision of this belief was something she examined carefully over several evenings alone, that he was in a position she had not fully accounted for, and that the position was becoming more uncomfortable as the picture built, that he was, possibly, someone for whom the picture being built was not an abstraction, that what she was assembling from 47 fragments was, for him, something he already had direct access to, something whose outline he had been watching emerge from her investigation like a shape he recognized in fog. She thought about asking him. She thought about it for 3 days. She ran through the conversation in her mind with the care she brought to any operational approach. What she would ask, what the possible responses were, what each response would imply for the investigation, and for him, and for her, and for the 47 names in the folder, and for the report she would eventually have to write. She thought about Chu in her careful small office, carrying 14 years of isolated conviction. She thought about Marchetti's letter to his daughter. She thought about Tennekin, who had commanded 3 major engagements and won 2 of them, going home to his apartment each night with belief he had never spoken aloud. On the 4th evening, she looked up from the file she was reviewing and said, "Kale." He had been writing. He stopped writing. "Whatever you're working through," she said, "you don't have to do it alone." The silence that followed was the longest one she had measured. Then he set down his pen with the same care she had noted weeks ago when he had set down Pren's file, and he said, "I know." He did not say anything else. She did not ask anything else. They returned to the files. But she noticed, in the days that followed, that something had changed in the quality of his analysis. Not his precision, that remained constant, but the direction of it. He began, with a care that she did not think was entirely conscious, to surface details she had passed over. Small things, a phrase in a personal record, a pattern in a data set, a sequence of decisions in a strategic log that told a slightly different story than the story she had been reconstructing, not contradicting her reading, supplementing it, adding dimension. She received each edition without comment, incorporated it into the picture she was building, and watched, over the remaining weeks, as the picture became something that she found increasingly difficult to hold at arm's length. She had entered the investigation believing her job was to determine whether 47 acts of treason had been accurately categorized. She was ending it understanding that the acts had been accurately categorized, and that the categorization was the least important thing about them. She wrote the first section in 4 days. It was, technically, the harder section, the one that required the evidentiary architecture, the sourcing, the careful navigation of classification levels and chain of custody documentation for materials that had been accessed through methods she would have to describe with a precision that was professionally honest without being professionally fatal. She had done this kind of writing before. She knew how to construct a finding that was defensible and complete, and that would survive review by people who would be looking for reasons to find fault. She was good at it. The 4 days were long, but they were not uncertain. The first section's conclusion was unambiguous. The 47 names were accurate. Each individual on the list had, at the times and in the manners described, passed information to the Veth Collective. The categorization of motivation as conviction was supported, in each case, by the investigative record. There was no evidence of coercion, no evidence of financial motivation, no evidence of coordination between subjects. 47 independent actors, acting from genuine ideological conviction, over a period of 23 years. She printed the first section, read it through twice, and found nothing to change. Then she sat for a long time without opening the second document. The second section had been building in her mind since the third week of the investigation, when she had first begun to understand the shape of what the 47 had independently concluded. She had not written any of it down in those weeks, not in her formal notes and not in her private ones. She had let it accumulate, which was a practice she used for conclusions she was not ready to commit to, letting them sit at the back of her attention, neither examined nor dismissed, while more evidence arrived. She had done this with 17 previous investigations, in each case eventually reaching a point where the accumulated weight became too precise to maintain as uncertainty. She had reached that point somewhere around the 40th name. She opened the second document and began to write. The second section's question was, were they right? She wrote it carefully. She wrote it the way she had written everything in this investigation, with the discipline of someone who understood that the words would exist in a record, would be read by people who would be looking at them with interests and pressures she could not fully anticipate, would potentially shape decisions whose consequences she could not trace. She wrote it carefully, and she wrote it honestly, and she wrote it in full, which took 7 days, not because the writing was slow, but because there were moments in it when she stopped and sat and looked at what she had written and needed time before she could continue. The second section was not a judgment. It was a reconstruction. She had assembled, from 47 independent sources, a picture of what the Veth wanted, what the Veth believed, what the Veth had been communicating in the ways available to them across 2 decades of a war conducted on premises that neither side had chosen, and both sides had continued from momentum and grief. She had used Osei's biological models and Schreiber's energy projections and Chu's translation framework, which was functional, she confirmed, because she had applied it to a series of Veth transmissions that the official xenolinguistics program had categorized as tactical noise, had found in them, not messages exactly. The translation was too partial, too fragile, but patterns, directional patterns, the kind of patterns that, in any communication system, indicated that the communicator was attempting something specific. The Veth had been trying to communicate. She wrote this sentence, and then she wrote the evidence behind it, citation by citation, and the evidence was not conclusive. She was careful about that. She wrote it precisely. She did not overstate what the evidence supported, but it was substantial, substantially more than nothing, substantially more than the current strategic consensus, which was that the Veth were not communicating because the Veth did not communicate with humans, which was not a conclusion, but a description of an outcome that, if the 47 were right, had been produced by a feedback loop. Humanity had not received Veth communication because it had not been looking for it in the right places, and the Veth had escalated because their communications were not being received, and the escalation had produced evidence of Veth aggression that had confirmed humanity's assessment that the Veth did not communicate. And the loop had continued. She wrote Tenneken's insight, attributed without identification. She wrote Schreiber's models. She wrote the pattern that Pren had been recording for 14 years in language so careful and so restrained that her superiors had read it as tactical observation. She wrote the portrait that the 47 had collectively assembled, the biologist's gift of a human body, the officer's gift of a human decision, the analyst's gift of a human language, the administrator's gift of a human argument. And she wrote what it meant that these 47 people, none of whom had known the others, had converged on the same answer across 2 decades of independent work. She did not write that the war should stop. She wrote only what the evidence supported. She wrote that the war had begun on a misapprehension, that the misapprehension was specific and documentable, that the 47 had identified it correctly, that the evidence for their identification was substantial and independent, and that the implication of this evidence was that a different kind of engagement with the Veth was possible and that the possibility had not yet been explored. She wrote this and she read it back and she found, checking it carefully as she checked all her work, that it was accurate, that she had not overstated, that she had given the evidence precisely the weight it could bear and no more, that the weight it could bear was enough. She formatted the report. First section, then second. She looked at it on the screen. 41 pages. The two sections clearly separated, the first ending with her finding on the 47 names, the second beginning with the question she had not been asked. She thought about Halloran, who had told her to find out whether the 47 were right. She thought about the specific grammar of that instruction. Find out, not report, not decide. She thought about the distinction between having found out and choosing to include what she had found out in the official record where it could not be recalled. She thought about what including it would mean. Not for her, though she thought about that too, briefly, with the practical clarity she had developed for thinking about the consequences of her own professional decisions. She thought about what it would mean for the record, for the institutional understanding of a war that had been running for 2 decades on the premise that the enemy did not communicate, did not want to communicate, that the only question was when and how they could be stopped. She thought about the 47 names, each one alone in a different room, each one having arrived at the same place, each one having tried, in the only way they could see, to close the distance between a species that was afraid and a species that was, perhaps, equally afraid. She thought about Cale, and about the particular quality of his silences in the last weeks of the investigation, and about what it meant that he had chosen not to tell her anything directly, but had, instead, surfaced the details that brought the picture into focus. She understood, sitting at her desk in a late hour, that he had been trusting her to do this, not to reach the right conclusion, which was not within his authority to direct, but to see clearly enough to make the choice herself, with full knowledge of what she was choosing. She thought about Pren, who had called a misunderstanding so fundamental it may not be recoverable. May not be, not cannot be. She thought about that for a long time. Cale had come by her office earlier that evening, not to discuss the report but to return a borrowed reference index, and at the door he had paused and said, without quite looking at her, "Whatever you decide, you've done the work." She had not asked him what he meant. She had not needed to. He had left, and she had sat down, and she had been sitting here since, with the report on the screen in front of her and the cursor blinking at the end of the second section, patient and regular as a heartbeat. The second section was complete. It waited. She had written the truth as precisely as she knew how to write it, and the truth was that the 47 names were accurate and the 47 people had been right, and these two facts together constituted a document that would either change everything or be classified into a silence so deep that no one would find it for another 20 years. By which time there would be more names, more people carrying the same conclusion alone in the dark, more grief accumulating on both sides of A. Misunderstanding that had been documented 47 times and never once admitted through official channels. She thought about the choir, singing alone in different rooms. She thought about the song. Outside her window, the station was very quiet. The ring had completed its cycle. The light was a gray of filtered space, steady and cold and very clear. She thought about how far that light had traveled to reach her and what it had passed through on the way, and how, if you didn't know what to look for, you might not notice what it was carrying. Her hand was on the keyboard. The cursor blinked. Once. Again. Again. The second section waited on the screen, complete, each sentence accurate, each claim supported, the picture assembled from 47 fragments whole and clear and legible, a portrait of a species, and a war and a silence that had been going on for 20 years, and everything that happened next depended on whether she included it or not, and she had not decided, and her hand was on the keyboard, and the cursor blinked and blinked and blinked.